Excellent.
Here we are at the 2025 NRA annual meeting. We're going to do a repeat engagement with Alex Ooley, young attorney from Indiana, because you gave us such a good interview last time about engaging with people of your age cohort, and I really appreciate that, because for us who are entering our 7th decade, that seems like a really big ask, and so you gave us a good piece for that, and I always link to these things back when we bring you back on, because you always tell us stuff we need to know. But here's the exciting thing about Alex's life. He's a dad now. He's a dad. And so this opens up a whole new world, if you will, a whole new set of concerns, because now it's not just you taking care of yourself, or as came along, you taking care of yourself and your wife, who I'm sure also is very capable of taking care of herself, but now there's 3 of you. And the one didn't come really fully capable of taking care of himself. So what do we do about Tate?
Yeah, you're right. The most exciting news in my life since we last spoke is that I'm now a father. Our son is almost 16 months old now.
Wow.
And so blessed to have him in our life. But with that blessing comes many responsibilities, of course.
It really does. The good news is, of all the people I know, you are so capable, and I mean, yeah, you'll have your stumbles. We all have your stumbles. But you've got this ethos of preparedness that's always identified yourself. So I think that what we should do for our viewers who may not have seen us last time, tell us a little bit about you, tell us a little bit about your profession, and then let's talk about becoming a family man.
Sure. So my name's Alex Ooley, of course, and I'm an attorney in Southern Indiana. I do mostly criminal defense work, which includes self-defense on many occasions. I've been an affiliate attorney with the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network for quite some time. I don't remember when we first became affiliated. I do remember that I learned of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network for the first time with an instructor named Tiger McKee. He ran
Yes.
Shoot Right Academy in Alabama. Unfortunately, is no longer with us, but he handed us one of your brochures that you have here at the meeting, and it hasn't changed a whole lot, but it does look a little different than it did.
Those
But
materials are so classic. They just really, the principles really don't change.
They really don't. They really don't. And reading that brochure and going through that course with Tiger McKee actually influenced me to go to MAC 40 with Massad Ayub, and at the time I was contemplating whether or not to go to law school, and I decided, this is an area of the law that I have a really genuine interest in pursuing. And so that was part of my rationale for going to law school, was having gone through the course with Tiger McKee and MAC 40, and of course my father, Mike Ooley, is an attorney as well, so that heritage was there to begin with.
Well, and you were a son of a military family first and foremost, but also of gun owners, and the son of armed citizens. So you came to it almost genetically.
Yes, very nearly. That's right. So I became very passionate about helping people become responsible armed citizens, and that includes not just the firearms training aspect, but also the legal aspect, and being prepared to address the self-defense question and anything that might come in the aftermath. And so the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network is obviously very valuable for the educational component, and I think really augments the firearms training that people receive, because it's not just about the gun, it's about the mind and the mental preparedness to be responsibly armed.
Well, and I think that mental aspect is well, it's the hardest thing to teach, because now you've got to get into people's motivation. Now you've got to get into their psyches to a certain degree and say, maybe you need to turn away from some of the things you do. John Farnham calls it repenting. You got to love John Farnham.
Yes.
But to say, if I want to live safely and if I want to keep my family safe, there may be some changes that I have to make in my life. And
that's right.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, it takes a great deal of humility. And I think that humility is often lacking, especially in gun owners. You hear about sometimes what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that is where people have a lack of confidence when they first are introduced to a subject matter, but then shortly after, they think that they've become experts all of a sudden, and they're unconsciously incompetent. And I think to get beyond that state of unconscious incompetence, you have to have a degree of humility. And I think that the more training you get, the more education that you pursue, the more humility you tend to instill in yourself, because you realize that you don't know everything, and you can never know everything.
Well, that's the thing, and you have to have a certain amount of exposure to realize that there's so much more than what I see. When I was very young in martial arts, probably in my 20s and 30s, my mother called it my small nation with a nuclear arm effect. And she was right, because there was so much beyond at that point that as a young practitioner I didn't know. Well, the same thing absolutely, as you described, applies to being an armed citizen, applies to having guns in the home, applies to carrying guns, applies to how do I interact on behalf of my children and my spouse and even my parents, people that I care about. How do I interact with the world? And it's interesting to watch, because I think that you're coming to it much earlier in life than I did. It's interesting to watch those questions come up. What has been some of the surprises for you going down that path?
So with having well, let me back up just a little bit.
Yes.
Certainly it requires a great deal of training and education to be responsibly armed as it pertains to me as the individual.
First.
But then it really complicates things when you add a spouse, or you add a child to the mix, and the dynamic changes significantly. And I think that, and I wouldn't hold myself out as the expert on this issue, but it's something that I've given a great deal of thought about in anticipation of a child, and then now having had a child. It's something that really matters to me, obviously. It's one of my most prized things in the world is my son and of course my wife. And as I was thinking about this, my thinking has evolved just in the 16 months that we've had our child to some degree, even though I did give it a great deal of thought beforehand.
Well, and I think that that's worth noting is you didn't bring a baby home one day and say, oh my goodness, now what do we do? You began thinking about it during the pregnancy.
That's right. And there are all sorts of things that you're anticipating, that you're thinking about when you're about to have a child. Of course, how are you going to coordinate childcare? How am I going to change a diaper? Oh my goodness, I've never changed a diaper. There's no such thing as a tactical diaper change, by the way.
Sure, that's true. It's just going to be messy.
There is nothing cool about it, and no way to make it cool. Anyway, one thing, and I get this to some degree from Greg Ellifritz, who, as you know, awesome. He's contributed to the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network content a great deal. He has a website with fantastic content. He has the Weekend Knowledge Dump. I don't remember, and if I can find the article, I'll send it to you so you can include
we'll ask Greg, maybe he can find it for us.
I recall having read an article on his blog about, and this was before I became a father, about a scenario where you are faced with an armed robbery while you have your child. Your first instinct is to protect or guard your child, but that may not be the appropriate action in that moment, because think about if you're in an armed robbery, if the armed robber is equipped with a firearm, trying to get in front of them could actually put them in danger. So what he advocates, and I think that depending on the scenario, this can be great advice, is that you need to create distance, if at all possible, between you and your child, especially if it's an infant.
And boy, is that counterintuitive.
It is totally counterintuitive. And I was actually thinking about this during church. I was holding my child, and I'm thinking, this was shortly after we hosted Ed Monk for his active shooter response seminar. I'm thinking, if there were an armed attacker that came into this church, what would I do with my child? Because if I'm going to engage the attacker, I do not want to be holding my child.
That's a good point. Are you going to set him down on the floor
and where do I sit him?
6 feet away?
Right. Those are things that you have to contemplate.
Yeah.
And those are the sorts of scenarios, whether it's the armed robber in the gas station parking lot or the shooter that's walking into your congregation during a church service. Those are the things that you have to think through ahead of time about how you will handle your child. And it may depend on how old the child is. If it's an infant,
absolutely.
That will be much different than if you have a 4 or 5 year old or even older child who may be able to take some direction, you may be able to drill or game ahead of time in certain ways. And I think that this as it pertains to older children, I think you can practice, so to speak, for these types
Absolutely.
of scenarios.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is incredibly important to instill in children without instilling fear in children,
That's tough.
which is tough, is to practice awareness. Because what do we talk about so much in armed defense?
Yeah,
Awareness and avoidance. If you
Yeah.
can avoid the situation, you should do that. And I think you can instill that in children at a young age without instilling fear. And that may be as simple as playing like an old game that my brother and I used to play, I Spy. Right?
Yes.
So you look around your environment and you say, I spy, and you describe whatever the thing is, and the other child or whoever you're playing the game with has to figure out what that is. And I think that wasn't our intention in playing that game, but that was the sort of practice that instilled awareness and a cognition of our environment.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are the sorts of things you can do with your child to instill that awareness.
Man, I cannot imagine setting a baby down and moving 6 or 12 feet away, but Ed is right. It's necessary. But the other thing even comes up in less threatening situations is a lot of us work real hard to keep our hands free. Means wearing a backpack when it looks dorky, or weird things like that. But your child is going to be in your arms. How are you dealing with having one hand tied up the whole time? And what do you do with the diaper bag in the other hand?
And if there is a situation where the threat is so imminent, you need to think about that. And can you handle your firearm one-handed? Can you draw? Can you engage the attacker one-handed? So if you can get distance from your child, that's ideal, especially if it's an infant. And if you can't, how are you going to handle that situation? And are you equipped to do it from a skill standpoint?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So I think that's incredibly important to train. Think about that while you're training and how you would handle that situation. Speaking of trying to have hands free, I got as a gift a baby carrier.
A halter, yes.
And it looks relatively tactical. It has Molly type things on it, and it has a patch that says "Come and take it." It's a milk bottle. So I've embraced the dorkiness to some degree.
Maybe that's the best way to do it. But you're right. There might be times that you could literally hang the child off of yourself as long as you weren't doing appendix carry or something.
Yeah. But the difficulty with that, and something you have to think through, is then how do you get separation if your child is literally attached to you? So that presents another layer of difficulty and things something you have to consider.
Ideally, and our sheepdogs have even had trouble with this. You're with your spouse, you hand the baby off, you say, go outside, and you guys worked it out ahead of time that you know where you're going to hook back up.
That's right.
Even something as simple as calling for help on a cell phone. I mean, it's hard enough when you're under a little stress anyway.
Yes.
I'm talking about minor fender bender and suddenly the phone won't work, right?
Yes.
The phone was working fine.
Yeah.
The human wasn't working so well.
That's right.
Which is why the fender bender occurred probably.
Yeah.
But in any case, then you start extrapolating that into something where you think lives may be lost or at least people might be injured. And I don't know if you can even run comms. But then here you got the baby squalling too. I mean, it gets really overwhelming. It's almost as if the process needs to start with hardening yourself in a way, working through the stuff. What tricks have you used to get yourself into a place of acceptance that says, yeah, I may have to fight and my child may be part of it? How do you even face that?
Sure. One of the things that my dad and I talk about, we teach a 5-hour legal class about armed self-defense. And one thing that you hear routinely in the aftermath of a shooting or an attack is that some of the people who were there felt overwhelmed to a degree that they thought, this is surreal. I never believed that this could happen to me. Mm-hmm. And so I think without going through that sort of attack yourself, none of us, we can't practice that. I mean, you can do it with, with airsoft or with blanks or
and your
various
mind
types.
Still knows they're blanks.
Right, your mind. So you can only go so far in training to replicate that stress.
Yes.
And so I think that the best thing you can do, aside from the force-on-force type training, is to really think through as many of these scenarios as possible. And I think that one of those resources, I think one of the best resources in this regard is John Correa's Active Self-Protection website. He's done thousands of reviews of these types of attacks, whether that's armed robberies or mass shootings. And I think that thinking through those situations and how you would respond helps to mitigate or minimize that feeling of being overwhelmed, that feeling that this is surreal, and rather instills a mindset that I knew this could happen, I've seen this before, and I know what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of preparation, that mental preparation, can help you to fight back or to think and have the mental capacity to think, how am I going to address this? How am I going to escape this situation potentially? Rather than having the freeze response, that overwhelming stress response.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
How much do you and your wife game plan these things ahead of time? Do you talk about, well, we're going down to the stadium tonight, and here's what, I mean, to what granularity have you two worked together to strategize who does what and how it works?
Yeah, so I think this is a great, I think being on the same page with your spouse is important in lots of areas, right?
So true.
But I think that people, there tends to be, I think, this sense that, oh, the man's just going to take care of it, or the woman, if they're the ones who are trained
and we are very, very culturally predisposition to, well, it's Alex's job.
Right. Yeah. Division of labor. You take care of that, I'll take care of the child. And
Absolutely.
I think that can be okay, but I think that both spouses need to be prepared to do the other's job.
There you go. Cross-training.
Cross-training, yes. And so if I have the child and I may be the one who needs to leave the situation, or
God, I wonder if you can do that.
to pass off or pass him off if I can, so that she can leave with him.
Yeah.
But I think that communicating about how you handle that ahead of time is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And it can get to a significant degree of granularity. Is it at
so hard.
Is it at the Little League baseball field? And that's going to be much different than if you're in church, for instance, or in a public space like we are here today in the convention floor.
Yeah.
What would somebody do in a situation? It's going to be
and there's even layers of that. I mean, parking lots and parking garages. Lord, how I hate parking garages.
Yes.
But there's a vulnerability there because predators know that that's where people get in and out. And now you've got the situation where the child's got to be strapped in a car seat. And I'll be hornswoggled if I know how you're supposed to get the kid in and out without having your rear end hanging out the door,
right,
and your head inside the car as if you were an ostrich, for heaven's sakes. How in the world do young people deal with that?
Yeah, and that's a great scenario to talk about. I mean, if you're with your significant other, they're the person who can stay aware of the surroundings, because it's nearly impossible when you've got a baby who's crying, who doesn't want to go in the car seat, and you're focused on that task, and it's almost impossible to be aware of what's going on around you. So, I think that it's incredibly important to think about, where am I going to park in those if I'm by myself with my child, how to mitigate the danger there. Maybe I can park in a place where there's nobody behind me or against a wall, or in that way I can. Right, exactly. But to the extent that you're with your spouse, that other spouse can be the lookout, so to speak, to make sure that.
I think going places by yourself with the baby has got to be just a magnitude more difficult, more challenging.
Yes.
I mean, even just driving safely if the child is upset.
Yes.
I mean, where does your focus go? But that brings us to something else that you hinted at when we started throwing around, could we talk about this? And that is that this parental safe lifestyle goes so much beyond the gun. And you hinted at that earlier here this morning. There's so many other things that, as a parent now, what do I do if there's a natural disaster? Does this change my decision whether I shelter in place or whether I run for it? How has the bigger part, beyond just planning for getting jumped in the parking lot or getting picked for an armed robbery, how does this higher angle view about life in general
there's obviously a lot that can go into that consideration. There's the natural disaster situation, and obviously during the first year of our child's life, we had to be concerned about, are we going to have enough breast milk or formula available in the event that we can't get any. So and he can't eat solid foods. So what are you going to do there? So there's that sort of preparedness. Do we have a generator to keep him warm if it gets cold when it's in the middle of winter and we lose power? All those things become much more important when it's not just you. Yeah. Right?
You could get in a mummy bag and probably survive and go hungry for a day. He's 20 pounds at best, and
that's right.
He can't do it.
But there are also other considerations. How do you prevent? I mean, the internet and social media and the online presence. It makes identity theft, for instance, very prevalent and a new danger in the new world. And you have to be worried about that with your child as well. So how do you think about protecting your child's identity and their privacy and security going forward? So there are all sorts of things that add complexity to a preparedness lifestyle when you have a child. And I'm not a tech expert, so I'm not an expert on identity theft protection or things like that. But what sort of access do you give them to social media? What sorts of things can they post on social media? Are they things that might compromise the security of your family? For instance, are you going to post about traveling for vacation, right? And give the world notice that your house is going to be, vacant.
What if grandma likes to post baby pictures? Not your mom, but some grandmas might not even see that as possibly attracting a predator in.
That's right.
I don't know how you're supposed to put your foot down with your own mom.
That's right. That's right. So those are all things that I've considered and have been. I don't have answers, and the answers might.
And they might change tomorrow anyway.
They might change tomorrow.
Circumstantial.
But I think they are things that people should think about and really talk through with your spouse, because I think having a unified approach is incredibly important to preparedness and into marriage in general. But
wow, that's a good point. And now think about this: what happens when there's two little guys?
Yes.
What happens when there's three little guys?
That's right. That's right. And I think that, as your child gets older, I think that a lot of people see this where children, we live in a time where we have so much wealth and prosperity that children often can coast through life and they're sort of coddled and don't have much responsibility. But I think it's important, like I said, alluded to earlier, about teaching children awareness and avoidance. I think that's important, but I think also teaching them to take responsibility. What sorts of things can the older child do to help with the younger child? Maybe the 4 or 5 year old is old enough to know if Daddy says emergency, that means go to the safe place, and that means take your younger brother or younger sister. So I think teaching them, instilling that sort of responsibility in them at an early age helps cultivate a child who is empowered, who can really turn into a responsible adult.
You're building a cadre.
That's right.
Yes, you are. Yeah. Well, that totally makes sense. And you talk about as the first one starts to get older, and in some ways, I don't know if this is a blessing or a curse, because now what happens? I mean, playgrounds can be really feeding a watering hole for predators, and I don't know whether a modern parent today should even go to the playground with their kid. And then what happens? You referenced this in an example earlier, Little League. Well, we can't not let the child participate in the fullness of life, but my goodness, there's so many threats associated with it. It's not here yet, but the time's going to come where you and your wife are going to need to start thinking about that. How do we mitigate? Are we going to let him go to somebody's house overnight? My goodness.
Well, and are we going to send him to a school? I mean, what sorts of concerns are there with government schools or private schools, or what sorts of security measures do they have? Do they have a school resource officer? Do they have armed? Do they allow their teachers to be armed? Those sorts of considerations as well. And you don't want to deprive your child of an education, but you don't want to exercise or engage in unreasonable risk either. So,
I'm such a fan of homeschooling, and it's gotten so much easier over the past several decades. There's such a stigma on it quite some time ago. Now there's a lot of resources if you simply said, we're going to get him through 6th grade. We're going to get him through, and I don't know where that breaks up to where you got to put him into the system.
Right. I agree. I'm a huge fan of homeschooling. As a matter of fact, this weekend at the NRA annual meeting, I'll be talking with the Tuttle Twins, which is a book series tailored to young children about the principles and ideas of liberty and freedom.
Wow,
and,
the Tuttle Twins,
and you certainly don't get that sort of education in a public school or even most private schools. So I think the flexibility that comes with homeschooling is incredibly important. And I don't want to delve on this in the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, but I think that my point is you have the flexibility to teach them the values and the principles that you want to teach them.
Yes.
And there's also the benefit of what sort of security you have available. You know the sorts of adults that are going to be around your children and the sorts of ideas that they will be exposed to, and also what sorts of people they're around.
Yeah.
You know, are there sexual predators around? Are there violent people around? You don't know that. When you send your child to a school, you don't know those things.
I was listening to Megan Kelly on Town Hall just this last week, and she talked about how, and I think they took their children out of the New York school system because in 3rd grade they asked him if he really believed he was a boy. My goodness.
Yeah.
But you're going to hold on to that child until he's formed and then turn him loose on the world.
Right. Yeah. That's
Look out, world! There's another Ooley out there.
That's right. And the other thing is that I gave an example earlier about how you can start to instill the idea of responsibility in the child. I think that teaching children to take responsibility for their own education is something you can do through homeschooling as well. And you can do it without homeschooling. The child can go to school during the day, and you can still do things to augment or supplement what the child is doing during the day. But I think instilling that passion for learning and self-learning is incredibly important, not only for general knowledge and thinking about the world, but also for when it comes to preparedness and self-defense.
Yeah, survival issues as well. But yeah, you really are letting them know everything's not going to be handed to them on a plate and they just consume it. They may have to go. Maybe they don't want to be an attorney. Maybe they want to be a physician. Well, then that means they're going to have to start doing the sciences.
Yeah.
Not the humanities.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I like about knowing you is your podcast. Your podcasts are so frequently parallel to some of the things that I read, and that always kind of makes me happy. And I know every now and then I'll send you an email and say, "Yeah, I was just looking at that," or "Hey, you took me to that, and what a resource it was." So tell us a little bit about your public presence. I mean, hopefully we don't need you as an attorney.
That's right.
If I do, at least I know who to call.
Right.
But what about some of these more philosophical things? Because on Forge of Freedom, I very much get a philosophical overlay that then everything else comes up underneath that.
Yes. So I started podcasting.
Yes.
Actually in your booth in 2019 in Indianapolis with, I was a guest with Paul Lathrop on the Polite Society.
And you were on the Bullet for a while with him, right?
Yes. After we became acquainted in 2019, and after that we reconnected through the Bullet podcast and the Polite Society podcast. And so I was a guest for a while, just talking about firearms and Second Amendment related issues from an attorney's perspective primarily. But I care deeply about the right to keep and bear arms and the Second Amendment, but I care more broadly about freedom and about personal responsibility and cultivating people who can make the world a better place from the bottom up. I think that freedom is created and preserved from the bottom, not from the top down, not from the government.
Right.
And so I want to, through the podcast, through the Forge of Freedom, it's partly a self-accountability mechanism for me to think through these sorts of things, but also to convey these messages, these ideas to people who have an interest in the same sort of world that I have an interest in. One where people share and hold values about what it means to be a good person, what it means to live a good life, what it means to be a good person, a good husband, a good father. And I actually have a background in philosophy. I studied philosophy
It shows.
in college. So I bring my passion for liberty, my passion for the right to keep and bear arms to bear in the podcast, and my philosophical background to really help teach people the foundational principles of liberty. And so that's what I hope to bring through the Forge of Freedom podcast. And I talk about all sorts of topics. There's a broad range of topics.
It does.
And so that's really the purpose behind it. So I sort of catapulted from the Second Amendment, firearms related guest, type podcasting to the Forge of Freedom, so I could talk about more than just firearms.
Well, and indeed, it is a broad-ranging podcast. So if we were to look it up, I suppose, I'm kind of Apple-centric, so iPod, Stitcher,
Yeah. So
the others. Tell us how we find you.
ForgeOfFreedom.com.
Okay.
That's the easiest place to find.
Oh, okay.
Whatever channel you want to go to from there. So if you want to watch it on YouTube, it's available on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook. But all the links to those various platforms are available on ForgeOfFreedom.com, and it's also available on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. So whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Pandora or Amazon, whatever, it's probably available there.
Well, that's cool, and I like it that the archives are so well maintained. A while back, I was looking for a piece you did or talked about why charity was becoming kind of a failing thing, and I think I may have, if I didn't email you after that, I should have, because it was so right down the line. It was coming with the USAID thing falling apart, and you had spoken on that. You had read somebody's column into the podcast, and it just gives us a place to jump off from and say, well, I may not own the whole idea on this, but here's some auxiliary things that may work for me. And then you bring in your own viewpoint on it as someone from the next generation who's coming up behind me and Marty, and then Doris and Mike, and then you and your wife, and then your son after that.
That's right.
There's a continuity here that I find very, very attractive.
Yeah. And that's part of the idea behind the podcast. The Forge of Freedom is that we forge the life we want to live, and that we build a community with like-minded people to spread our ideas and to spread the way of living, the way that we think leads to a good life, that leads to a fulfilling life, and one that lots of other people can live as well. So the idea, like I said, is to forge that kind of life in your own environment, and that freedom more broadly will spread through
as a result.
As a result, that's right.
That's wonderful. Well, I'll tell you what, and it's real interesting, because now we're not talking about having to go live in compounds with like-minded people. Now it is so broadly, you've taken that voice and said, I can talk to somebody in Florida, I can talk to somebody in California, and it does become so much more exposed. So I never know, when I sit down and talk on one of these, what parts I don't know. That's that Dunning-Kruger thing.
That's right.
I don't know what I don't know. Back to raising children. What did you wish that we'd talk about that we didn't talk about this morning?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm still in the same camp as you. There are lots of things that I don't know, and that I don't know. Yeah. So it's difficult. I'm one of these people when I'm new to something, or I'm trying to learn a new skill, whether that's firearms or fatherhood, that I try to consume as much information as I can. And
You're a sponge.
It's hard to decipher all of it and to assimilate it in a way that's applicable to you. So I read up on what it means to be a father through all sorts of books and things like that. But I think that what anybody has to know is that you can't just read a book and that's going to be the way I'm going to be a father, or that's the way I'm going to be an armed citizen. Everybody has to take their own approach, bring some critical thought to it, and assimilate it to your own life. And so I'm still going through that process myself, but I think that people, again, need to approach any topic with that humility that I'm going to try to do the best I can. I'm not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Don't get discouraged when you're not perfect, and continue to learn and carry that humility throughout whatever process or act you're engaged in. And I think that really matters, no matter whether that's becoming a responsibly armed citizen or becoming a good father. And I think that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Ah, well put. And just about the time you think you've got it, then you'll have a teenager.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
All right. Any final thoughts?
Personal, but it's also something that I'm still learning, and so it's very. I think I'm more. I think vulnerable in this sort of conversation,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And so I hope that people get something out of it.
They will.
And if any fathers or parents out there, I'd look, if you see this on YouTube or wherever you see it, I'd like to get your thoughts, and don't hesitate to tell me I'm full of baloney. All right.
Well, it comes down to that community. Maybe there'll be other people that step up. You'll support people, and there'll be people who say, "Well, I got through that by doing X, Y, Z." But
Right.
that's wonderful, Alex. Thank you so much. Thanks for being part of the network family and for sharing your family with
Of course.
ours.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely.
wonderful.
Thank you.